What's up, everybody? Welcome to System Crafters Live. I'm David Wilson, and today we're back with another Friday live stream where we get together as a community and chat about whatever topic I've come up with for the week. And this week is no exception. I want to say hello to some people who are here already. Hello to Fabian, Star7, Gun, Amovedia, Appenzel, Gaspard, Solemn Skater. Nice to see all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Already getting some good questions and discussion in the chat, which is great. Glad to see it. So this week we're gonna try doing the original streaming setup with only a single computer, so that maybe we won't have the stream die most of the way through last time, because that was a little bit annoying, and I think it was confusing to people who were looking at the last stream recording video when the first one hadn't even been posted yet. So yeah, people were a little unhappy with the fact that there was a 13-minute video that had no context. But anyway, that's what happens sometimes whenever you're using free software and trying to do streaming. Hello to Mark and Anton and Jeff. Good to see all of you. Yes, it is a good evening. It's just about to be getting into sunset mode here. It's only about 6 o'clock. I guess you can see it up here on my clock on the status bar. But anyway, let me just get right to the updates. Not really any updates this week. Didn't get a video out, obviously, but work has been much busier than usual. Unfortunately, my job has become more complicated, so I think that I haven't had as much time this week. We're still dealing with certain things with the house as well, like getting things set up. We got a lot of our appliances and stuff installed this week, so a lot of time taken up on all that. But I am planning to get back to doing a video on Embark next week. I'm not gonna say for sure. I want to do it really bad, but I also have things going on next week too, so we'll see how it goes. But I'm excited to do it, that's for sure. Hello to Drishal and Piotr. So the one thing I did want to mention one more time is that Mickey Peterson, the author of Mastering Emacs, has done a really nice thing where he's set up basically like an affiliate link for the channel, where if you would like to get a copy of Mastering Emacs, which is a very well-known book about Emacs, very in-depth, very good compliment to this channel. If you've spent a lot of time watching the Emacs videos on this channel, you'll probably learn some new things in the book Mastering Emacs that you haven't learned here. So if you're interested in getting a copy of that book, check out the website for Mastering Emacs with this link that has this /r/systemcrafters on the end, because if you do buy a copy of the book from Mickey, then some part of the proceeds of that will actually go to supporting the channel, which is really cool. I really appreciate him setting that up. Aside from that, oh, the other thing about that book is nice that people have mentioned a few times is that I got distracted by a joke that Gun made here. Mickey always updates the book for free for future versions of Emacs. So if you buy the book, you get free updates for life, basically. All right. FTP Gamer says, what is the distro you're on? It's GNU Geeks. And what's the desktop environment? Right now, I'm using Erbsluft Window Manager. Mehmet says, would you recommend the book to Doom Emacs users? If you are a Doom Emacs user, you are an Emacs user. So yes, I would definitely recommend it to you, because even if you're using Doom, it's still all the same stuff in Emacs. You're still using all the same concepts. Maybe Doom has got a lot of nice packages in there that makes things easier for you in certain ways, but it's really good to understand the fundamentals of Emacs and a lot of sorry, I'm getting sidetracked here, but looking at the chat. The sort of core concepts and functionality of Emacs, because maybe one day you don't want to use Doom, and maybe you want to try to make your own configuration from scratch, or maybe you want to do something else, or maybe write your own package. It's good to have a fundamental understanding of everything in Emacs for that. Jeff says, I'm looking to develop a module for crafted Emacs based on that book, just haven't got around to it. That's cool. I would like to see that for sure. Hello to Saeed and Eric, Ilya. Oh, the war in Ukraine kicked you out for some time. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. F2B Gamer says, is GNU Geeks good for beginners? I would say not really. I mean, it depends on what type of beginner we're talking about, because if you're a beginner to Linux, GNU Geeks has some special characteristics that make it a lot more difficult to get started with, especially if you use like a modern laptop and you're trying to install it on a laptop, because it doesn't have all the drivers and stuff that you need, or the firmwares. So I would not recommend it to someone who's a beginner to Linux. But if you are a Lisp enthusiast and you're interested in using a distribution of GNU Linux that is configured using Scheme, which is a dialect of Lisp, then it might be worth the trouble, because it's pretty interesting, and I think it has quite a lot of useful features. You should check out all the videos I've made about it. You'll learn more about it. Hello to Boyan. Vidbina says, curious to know how you good folks use Emacs org mode to collab with folks. Do you just share through repos, or is org mode primarily a self-organization tool? Well, at least in my case, it's mostly just for me. I've also seen a coworker of mine write org mode files and then convert those to Markdown and then try to check those into a repository. But the problem is that there's a lot of org metadata that gets baked into the Markdown files, so people aren't super happy to look at that. People prefer, like, you know, plain Markdown. So anyway, that's probably not, I'm not a good person to speak on that, because org obviously is best, excuse me, best supported in Emacs, but there are other editors that have org plugins, but I think it's gonna be a hard sell to try to get coworkers that use like VS Code or JetBrains or whatever to try to use org mode for stuff. F2P Gamer says, do you live inside of Emacs? Like, really? Well, I live in a house, but in my computing life, yeah, I mean, the majority of my time spent in Emacs. It was more so whenever I was using EXWM all the time. But I haven't done that for a while. Star7 says, org files works in GitHub. Yes, org files do work in GitHub. Eric says, I've been playing around a bit with the Eric email client. I think that's one of Drew DeVault's things. I have not used it, but it seems pretty cool. Gunn has a good point. Gunn says he uses it for converting docs to company documents by a LaTeX. Looks like the original MS doc format. Yeah, that's pretty cool. If you can do that, then it might be reasonable to use that in a work environment. But if anybody edits the document, then converting it back to org mode, I don't know how well that works. Gunn, have you seen anybody be able to update a document that was converted? I guess if you're using LaTeX, probably not so much. Maybe if you're using Pandoc, it would work. Anyway, let's get to the point. Today, what we're going to do is take a look at the EIEIO library. And if you've ever heard the song Old MacDonald, this probably sounds pretty funny to you. That comes built into Emacs. This library actually looks really useful if you want to write more sophisticated code in Emacs Lisp, because it enables you to add new types to Emacs with things like type inheritance, dynamic methods dispatch, and a whole lot more. And if these things don't make any sense to you, we'll walk through it a little bit and I'll show you exactly what that means. It's based on the Common Lisp Object System, which is basically an object-oriented programming. I don't know if a library is the right way to call it. I think it's more of like a specification that Lisp implementations can implement. Even Scheme implementations have done it too. But it is a way to have something like object-oriented programming. It's not exactly object-oriented, which we'll get into, but it does give you some added flexibility that's pretty nice for more sophisticated programs. There's a really good book that I haven't read, but I've scanned through it online called The Art of the Meta Object Protocol, which is one that people quote a lot when they talk about the Common Lisp Object System, which explains like what the actual design and purpose of the meta object system is. I don't know how far we'll get into meta object protocol today, but maybe if we get into some of that from the docs of EIEIO, we'll be able to see that. But yeah, you can check out that book if you want to learn more about it. Wind Up Boy says EIEIO is based on CLOS. Yes, I wrote that right there. So we're going to be going through basically the EIEIO manual and trying things out. I've not used EIEIO before. I've used a few packages that use this in their core, but I've never actually hacked on any code with it. But I have been reading a little bit about CLOS recently, and I think it's pretty interesting. So I kind of wanted to give a look to this today, since it's relevant to Emacs users, people who might want to write packages, and also might just be a curiosity to those of you who are Lisp enthusiasts. So yeah, I don't have any other notes aside from that. All we're gonna do is just jump into the manual and take a look at everything, which I think should be pretty fun. So what I'm gonna do is load up the info system, metax info, then I'm gonna search for EIEIO, and then jump into the docs for that. So it tells us that it is the enhanced implementation of Emacs interpreted objects, and it provides an object-oriented layer for Emacs Lisp following the basic concepts of the CLOS, provides a framework for writing object-oriented applications in Emacs. So they have a little quick start here, if we just jump straight into that. Provides an object-oriented layer, blah, blah, blah. Here's a simple example of a class named person containing 3 slots named name, birthday, and phone. So before I go into more detail on what they're doing here, I'll explain to you what these various things are. Old McCarthy has a farm. Yes, that's probably the right part of the joke there. So if you don't have any experience with object-oriented languages, basically in many of them, the sort of first-class concept in the language is something called a class, which is effectively data plus operations, or data plus methods or functions. So you have a type like a person, excuse me, a person, and that person has, sorry, we're gonna go through this again. Certain data fields like their name or their birthday or their phone number, like what they have here in this example. And then there may be certain operations attached to that object type or that class type. Like maybe you wanna print their name or print their birthday or something like that. You would have methods for that, something called methods, which are basically just functions that are attached to that given class. So in this case, they're defining a class called person in this EIEIO. They say no superclasses. We'll get to that in a little bit. They have name here, birthday, phone, which are the fields for the class, but they don't have any methods here defined yet. Typically in a class that's defined in a programming language, you will see the syntax of the class definition would have both the data and the functions inside of it in many cases. Some languages don't do that, but many of the ones that we see, like C++, C#, Java, etc., it's pretty common to see them all together. So this is one difference here that you see, is that a class just has these slots, which are basically the data fields for the class. And there's various different things you can do to customize the fields for the class, like the initial argument, which we may have to look at the documentation for, because I'm not exactly certain what init arg means in this case. I'm sure that Faye could tell me. Init form, which is basically the default value for this. The type of the field, which is string. Custom, I think probably is an Emacs specific thing, which is for the customization system. And then the documentation for this field. So we got a lot of stuff that we can set on a given field, which we can see here. Same thing for birthday and phone. Nothing really new on either of those. I think actually what the init arg is when you create an instance of this person class, it binds the this keyword to this field. So if you create a person, then you can use the name keyword to set the value for that. And that's what Fade is saying in the Twitch chat right now. Basically, it's the keyword that references the field at initialization time. Thank you. All right, so let's just copy this. And maybe I'll jump into IELM just to have some fun evaling some forms. If I can jump to the end here. All right, so I've defined a person class. Now, I don't really know what to do with a person yet, so we'll have to go back to the manual to figure that out. So let's just jump back over to the manual. Also, it says each class can have methods which are defined like this. We have the CLDef method function that you can use for defining a class method. It's kind of interesting that we have def class as the macro for defining a class, and then it's CLDef method for defining a method. I don't know, there's probably some kind of historical reason for why that naming convention is there. So there's a method called callPerson, which accepts 2 parameters. One is the person to be called, and this is a little bit different. Usually whenever you see a function definition in Emacs Lisp or in Lisp in general, you don't see a parameter that actually has a type attached to it, but in this case you do. And that's a special thing to defining methods like this. If you have def method, it's not exactly like a defun where you're defining a function. methods have more logic baked into them, which we'll get into in a little bit if the documentation brings us there. So we're saying that this method applies to the person type, and this pers is the name of the argument for this method, which accepts a person. And then there's an optional parameter called script name. Obviously, we have the doc string here. It's pretty common for ELISP functions. Then it prints out a message, and then it will run shell command, which interesting that they would have something that can't actually run or work as an example, but it is what it is. So it tells us that basically the same things that I've said, but here's the interesting part. EIEIO dispatches methods based on the type of the first argument. Now, if it's only based on the first argument, that is different than what I've seen from CLOS. It seems like CLOS can do dispatching based on multiple arguments that all have their own types, but we'll get a little bit further and see what that looks like. Gun says, does that correspond to the self in Python or Perl? Yeah, so typically a method has like a this or a self where the object that the method is being executed against is the first parameter. So that's basically what this is doing here. Hey, Garjola. Garjola says, how do you say EIEIO in German? I think we'll have to have Gun help us with that. Fade says, in CLOS, each class instance also defines a type with the same name. Yes, that's right. Wait, each class instance defines a type with the same name? Oh, it's the instance of the class, not the instance created from the class, right? Okay. So when the call person method is called, the first argument is examined to determine the class of that argument, and the method matching the input type is executed. Mark says in German it would be EIEIO. Okay, interesting. EIEIO. Okay, so let me copy some of this stuff to the show notes just so that people can check it out later. So I'm gonna drop in the same form here. This form is good, but the one they're gonna give us for this method is not so good because it's, come on now, here we go. Because it's gonna try to shell out to something, it's just not gonna work. All right, so we'll go back to the info, we'll grab this method. I'm gonna drop this into here. All right, and then I'm gonna take out the shell command bit, and then I'll move call person over to IELM. Okay, so now there's a call person method. Let me use Control HF and look at call person, right? Call person actually is not a good name for this method, actually. We'll get into that later probably. So it has a signature with an argument that's not named pers, which is kind of interesting, but I bet I know why. And then general arguments. So I think it's basically defined a generic function here, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, so it has a list of implementations. That's nice. I'm glad to see that the documentation shows that. I don't know if helpful is the one doing it though. So we can try to run, well, we haven't seen how to create an instance yet. Let's see if we can tell how to create an instance. All right, so once the behavior of a class is defined, you can create a new object of type person. Objects are created by calling the constructor. The constructor is a function with the same name as your class, which returns a new instance of that class. Okay, so what we're gonna do is call person, name, David, birthday, what is it, Jan 1st, 1977? What's the Unix epoch? I don't remember. Let me fix that. This is bothering me. And then phone 8675309 for those of you who are old enough to understand that reference. Okay, so that creates an instance of person, but I didn't actually save it to a variable. So, was it 1970? Nice. All right, so set q David person. Let me just grab this form here. All right. So I've saved a new instance of person. Now I can use call-person on the David person. Okay, dialing the phone for David. So cool. So it actually did call that correctly, which is great. Let me check the chat. Gun says duck typing comes later. Ed says, create cow, chicken, and duck classes. Use those classes to reproduce the old MacDonald had a farm lyrics. That would be a pretty good idea. Class name person, no need to repeat class name and method name. Yes, absolutely. I don't know why they put that in the example, because it sort of defeats the purpose of using methods. Eric says, I thought I would want OOP, but I feel like I don't need it anymore. Well, yeah, with functional programming, the need for OOP goes away. But I think that the design of CLOS actually gives you a good middle ground between object-oriented programming and functional programming, because the methods for classes can still be used as first-class functions, and you can use them, you can pass them around and invoke them. So it's kind of interesting, especially whenever you consider the possibility of having lists of different objects, and then the same function can be applied to that, and then maybe dispatched with different behavior. So maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so we did that example. Okay, this is kind of interesting. So it can be a bit repetitive to also have a name slot. To avoid doing this, sometimes it's handy to use the base class EIEIO named. So that's interesting. So let's actually take a look at that. One of the things that you can do in CLOS typically is you can redefine a class at runtime. So what I could actually do here is to remove this name field. Let me just do. All right, so I'm taking this out. Now it says no superclasses. I'm going to put in EIEIO named here and see if that actually works, because what this does is say that person will derive from a class named EIEIO named. I wonder if so if I look at a variable, or what about a symbol? Wow, I can't find that. Describe, whoops. Describe, is there a describe class? Nope. CL describe type. EIEIO, yeah. Interesting. Okay, that didn't work, but let's try this anyway. Given parent class EIEIO named is not a class. Really? Where is it? So if I require EIEIO base, okay. Let's try that again. All right, that seemed to work. Now if I run the call person David person, it should, oh, invalid slot name. Love it. This object provides get set access to it. See, I don't like that. They tell you to do something and it just breaks the assumptions of what you've already done. Let's go back to EIEIO docs. All right. I don't know how I managed to get myself out of there. Gunn says, what about existing instances when redefining classes? Yeah, what Fade says is right. In Common Lisp, every instantiated instance is updated for the new class spec, but I don't know if that's actually the case in EIEIO. It seems like what happened here is that the instance did not get updated because it's acting like the slot name is invalid. Let me go back and create a new David person. Okay, even that tells me it's an invalid slot name. So where is the name supposed to be coming from if there's this EIEIO named? Name storage already occurs in an object. Well, it would be nice to see the definition of that, but I don't know how to find it. Let's see, info back. Okay, CO, cool. Fade says if EIEIO doesn't implement the full MOP, then this won't work. Yes, that's right. Cosmic Pegasus says, just wanted to thank you for the Emacs from Scratch series. I just finished it. Great, that's nice. Glad to hear that you liked it. Okay, calling methods on an object is a lot like calling any function. Okay, so yeah, we saw that. So let's go back to top. Introduction. So maybe we should have read the introduction first. Who knows? Please note, this manual cannot serve as a complete introduction to object-oriented programming. Well, of course not. All right, is it going to tell us this? It says that it is not a complete implementation of CLOS and differs from it in several aspects, but it follows the same basic concepts. They recommend that you read about CLOS first and object-oriented programming. Okay, all right, here we go. CLOS compatibility. Maybe we'll take a look at that in a little bit just to check it out. Okay, Jeff found it for us. Jeff says that EIEIO named uses object-name instead of name. Okay, that makes sense. But that basically changes the entire assumptions of the example that was being presented before. Okay, so maybe we can expand on this example a little bit. So we've already got the person class, the original definition of person class. That's all good. So call person. Well, I guess call person is fine if you assume that person is like the base class in a whole hierarchy. So what we could do is do something like clone this class and make a type called employee. Wow, what just happened? Employee. All right, and company. I know the first thing I reach for is employee, right? That's it just shows my American conditioning. All right, so let's just delete these things. I could also put manager here if we want to get really enterprisey. Manager. I want to speak to the manager. Manager. Okay. So init form, the guy who can fire me. Okay. Let's be a little bit less specific on gender. The person who can fire me. Okay. The name of a person. No, it's the employer's name. Company the person works for. Okay. Cool. So we've got employee, but this also needs to derive from person. So I'm going to put person in here. Wow. Once again, the hello thing bites me. A class for tracking my wage slave details. So I evaluated that and I now have an employee class, which is good. So now if I were to create an instance of an employee is sort of like metadata that should be on a person, but you know, we're just, Gun says manager should be an instance of person. I don't know, should it be? Or should it be some other type of being? I know there's probably managers of people who are watching this right now. I'm just making jokes here. Okay, so let's create an instance of that. I'm going to go back into the IELM here, and I can create a new instance of, let's see, David employee, person. No, it's going to be employee here. Employee, name David, birthday. This is, well, you know what? I should probably just like, let's do this. This is ridiculous. Set queue, test person. So we can just keep changing this. Employee, name, David. Let's put this in a edit buffer. Birthday, Jan 1st, 1970. I was not born in 1970. This is just a joke. Phone. Now, I also can put in, so the thing that I'm not mentioning, and I will mention now, is that since employee derives from person, the same fields from person apply to employee, or at least they should. This is sort of the whole point. I also have, what is it? Company. Acme Inc. And then manager, Bob. Okay. All right, cool. Let me format a little bit of stuff here as well. All right. Come on now. indent region. Cool. So I'm going to create this test person here. Whoops, invalid slot name. Which one? Name? Oh, I never reevaluated the person class. So I believe that the slot was not there. So I just reevaluated both of those. And now I've got an employee with the name David, blah, 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 all that stuff. Okay. So we got a test person to try out here. I can use the same call person on, what is it, test person. And now it says dialing the phone for David. Okay, so let's take a look at why this whole method thing is interesting. So we're gonna make a new implementation of this call person method, but instead of having it be person here, I'm gonna make it be employee. And I'm gonna take this script name off. I'm gonna see if this works. I don't know if it actually will work, but we'll find out. All right, so we have employee, capital letters, and then, yep, let's do this. All right, I'm just yelling at myself here. Okay, so I'm gonna evaluate this function. Now, what we've done here is not replace the call person implementation, but we've added a new method to the, what we would call a generic function called, or generic method called call person. So by creating a method, you've basically created a function that could have many different implementations, all based on which type that you're passing in. And now we have two implementations here, one that is keyed off of the class person and one that is keyed off the class employee. So if I were to go back into this code and run call person again, I'm calling this on an employee now. So, oh, I made a little mistake here, EMP, let's reeval that. Wow. There we go. Okay, so now we're gonna run it again. And now it says dialing the phone for employee David. If I were to go and change this test person creation, where is it? Okay, apparently, okay. Let's do this. I'll set test person to just a normal person. Then I'll call the same call person function, and now it just says dialing the phone for David. So based on the type of the object being passed in, it will call the right implementation of the call person method. So if you have a whole hierarchy of objects, then, well, it doesn't even have to be a hierarchy. They don't have to have the same base type. In fact, let's say, what if we create a new class, def class Android. This is sort of a person, right? So instead of typing all this out manually, I'm just gonna put a name down here. I'm not gonna put anything else in there. I don't really care. I need to have the empty brackets here, I believe. And then add another couple things. Now I have a class called Android. So if I were to create an Android, and this is not gonna work, just so you know. We know in advance it's not gonna work. So I'm gonna create an instance of Android, and I'm gonna use that with call person. So it says no applicable method, call person, and the type is Android, basically. It basically gives you the print out of the thing that you are passing in. Now, if I were to go and make a new instance of call person that targets the Android type, so Android, ANDR, I don't care about updating that. And then put in ANDR here. Then I can use call person, and it will say dialing the phone for Android. Now, here's one key difference between typical object-oriented programming and what you can do with CLOS or with EIEIO. In typical object-oriented programming, there's a concept called polymorphism, where if you have a a base class that defines some method, or like a virtual or abstract method, which we don't want to get into the details on that right now. Then a subclass, like let's say if you had the base class of a person and you had a method called call on that, and you have a subclass called employee, and you had a new version of the call method defined there, then you can call the call function on an employee and it will print out something different. But if you have another class called Android that does not inherit from person, then you can't call that method because it's not part of the same class hierarchy. In this case, it does not have to be related. These objects do not have to be related for the same method to have an implementation. So it gives you a lot more flexibility on how you structure your code. You can have completely different object structures. So for instance, if this was not call person, if it was just call, then you could have like call a company or call a taxi. Just whatever type has some concept of a call action, you could have a method implementation for that. Now, you probably shouldn't go too far with that, but it is a lot more flexible in this case. And the fact that the methods can be defined anywhere and not in the class definition itself. Like for instance, if you pull in a package, a different Emacs Lisp package, it's possible that that package could have a method implementation for a type that was defined somewhere else, not even in that package. So it gives another layer of extensibility that you don't get from typical object-oriented programming languages, because you would have to define the method in the class definition for the type. So it's a bit more flexible and a bit more interesting, and it doesn't fall prey to some of the typical problems people complain about with object-oriented programming, in my opinion. Elias says, is call person globally visible? I believe so, yes. So call person is just a plain old, well, it's a function, but it operates differently. The way that when you call it, different things happen. So if we look at the call person now, we'll see that there are 3 implementations of it. One for Android, one for employee, and one for person. Fade says, in CLOS, objects are pure nouns and generic functions dispatch on their type. Yes, it's much better. I kind of like that. Gun says there's 3 methods. One is drive screw, one is drive car, and one is drive nuts. That is possible. Okay. So let's go back into the docs and see what else is interesting about EIEIO. Okay. A structured framework for the creation of basic classes with attributes and methods using singular inheritance similar to CLOS. Now, I got the impression that you could do multiple inheritance with this because of the fact that you have a list in the position of the subclass. So that's kind of interesting. Maybe they have a reason for saying that. Type checking and slot unbinding. I don't know what slot unbinding means. Simple and complex class browser. Class browser? Browser. EIEIO browse. Create an object browser window to show all objects. Wow. Interesting. So if you, let me write that down in the show notes because that's kind of cool. You can use the Emacs EIEIO, what was it? Browse command to look at all, all classes defined in Emacs. All classes presently defined in Emacs. That's cool. So by looking at this, we can see that the Android class we created is here. There's a few other base classes for EIEIO. Singleton, we'll get into meta classes in a little bit, which will explain why there's a singleton here. Person, which has an employee that derives from that. Magit apparently is using EIEIO. Transient is definitely using it. There's a lot of stuff here. And apparently, even Magit is inheriting from some of the transient stuff. So there seems to be some extensibility for transient that Magit is taking advantage of, which makes sense because Jonas Bernoulli wrote the whole thing, so he knows exactly what to do. Leah says, as a Python programmer, I have nightmares about everything in global namespace. Yep, well, that's Lisp for you, or Common Lisp at least. Scheme has it also, but also Scheme has library support, so it'd be a little bit different. excuse me. Fade says that print object is typically defined as an after method. Yeah, that's really cool. The whole hooks thing. I actually think that's a really interesting concept for extensibility for a lot of stuff that you could do. I've been thinking about that a bit. All right, so the other stuff that we have here, auth source backend as a class apparently. Not a whole lot though, at least for the things that I'm using. It seems that transient and magit and maybe some JSON RPC for eglot and then auth source in my current Emacs session, those are the types that have been defined. But it's kind of nice to have this to take a look at all that. Let's go back to IELM and then we will look at info again. E-debug support for methods. Well, that should be the case. iMenu updates. Don't know what that is. Byte compilation for support for methods. That's good. Help system extensions for classes and methods. That must be why we were able to see the information about implementations of a particular method. Several base classes for interesting tasks, which I think we just saw there. Simple test suite. EIEIO. Let's see. Maybe there's a... find library. We're gonna use find library to find whatever EIEIO stuff is here. Base, core, compat, custom, speed bar. Interesting. Okay, so that's nothing here that I see about testing. So I would like to see what that means. Public and private classifications for slots. That's nice. So there could be a private class. I wonder how that works in practice though, for a private slot. Customization support and class extension to CLOS. That's probably the meta class functionality. Due to restrictions in Emacs Lisp, CLOS cannot be completely supported, and a few functions have been added in place of set F. Here are some important CLOS features that EIEIO presently lacks. Method dispatch. So EIEIO does not support method dispatch. If anybody wants to contribute to Emacs, you can fix this documentation bug here because that should be EIEIO. Does not support method dispatch for built-in types and multiple argument types. Yeah, multiple argument types, that's the thing I mentioned earlier. In real CLOS, method dispatch can be on multiple parameters. You can have multiple parameters with their own types that you can do dispatch on, which really is necessary if you want to have more sophisticated code. So the fact that they don't have an EIEIO is a little bit of a limitation. And also, it doesn't support method dispatch for built-in types. Well, that's probably because the built-in types were not defined using EIEIO, and they don't have the right metadata for the meta object protocol for that. I think in CLOS, there exists a way, in a normal Common Lisp implementation, typically they already have the types defined for the primitives like string, number, etc., etc. But with CLOS, there is the ability to define the metadata yourself if it wasn't already there. I don't think that Emacs Lisp allows that to happen because EIEIO is like an extension to Emacs Lisp and not part of the core implementation. It would be nice if like window or frame or buffer were classes, because then you could do method dispatch on those as well, but can't really do that, unfortunately. Support for meta classes. Okay, there's one default meta class, and you cannot define your own. Okay, the meta class tag and def class is ignored. I guess they put that there just as an aspiration, and not a real implementation. Also, functions like find class, which should return instances of the meta class, behave differently in that they return symbols or plain structures instead. Fade asks, I wonder if it has EQL specializers, and no, it does not. Oh, equal. Is that what that is? Like custom equal functions? Around method tag, this CLOS method tag is non-functional. Okay, we'll talk about that in a bit too if we get to it. Default init args. Each slot can have an init form tag, so this is not really necessary. Okay. Yeah, because a field can have a default value, you don't need to specify what the default init args are for the class itself. Mock object initializers. Each class contains a mock object used for fast initialization of instantiated objects. Yeah, whatever. Gun says, does it provide meta-class methods for introspection? It must. It must. Eric says, I want you to run meta x speedbar. Eric has asked me this a million times, and today I can actually do it because I'm not using EXWM. Speedbar. Yeah, I don't know what I'm doing in here, but it looks cool. Can I close this thing? Yeah, let's just leave it there. All right. So let's go back up and look at the next section. Building classes, how to make new class structures. We already did that. So let's see if there's anything we missed from the example before. So this says superclass list, which tells me that it must support multiple superclasses. Okay, so when defining a class, EIEIO overwrites any pre-existing variable or function bindings for the symbol class name, which may lead to undesired consequences. Before naming a new class, you should check for name conflicts. Yeah, since there's a global namespace for types, you could easily overwrite someone else's type, which is not very nice. If you had proper namespaces, then that wouldn't be a problem. And Fade says, this is why Common Lisp has many namespaces. Widen the left pane? Okay. There we go. That's better. I agree. Okay. To help avoid cross-package conflicts, you should choose a name with the same prefix you choose for the rest of your package's functions and variables. Yeah, typical Emacs coding convention. Class name symbols variable documentation string is a modified version of the doc string found in options and doc. Let me check person. Okay, person is a variable. I see. So there's a variable called person that has this variable is obsolete since 25.1. Maybe just the definition of it. So we got the documentation. And the value of it is a symbol. We have a person, yeah, we have a person function as well, because that's how you initialize a type of person. Okay. Oh, let's go back for a second. I want to take a look at that implementation. So this calls, what did I just do? Function, person. There we go. Apply make instance person slots. Okay, so it's just wrapping this make instance, which I think is basically what is supposed to happen in CLOS as well. There's like a make instance thing where you pass in the class as a parameter and then the init arguments to go into it. So you can create an instance of person the same way. So if I say make instance person, just with a symbol, it knows how to pick up the it knows how to find the class based on the symbol name. Hey, Andreas, nice to see you. And you're not too late. Humanly Type says, do you have any Emacs resources for Windows? I just got a Dell XPS that I can't run Linux on. It's been pretty idle because I know my way around Windows. I don't have any resources on that. I probably should make a video on it at some point because it is a little bit of a pain. The default or the native Windows build of Emacs can be slow in certain ways and it can be very annoying. So that's something to keep an eye out for. There's also the possibility of using the Windows subsystem for Linux, like Gun just said, and install Emacs that way because you get a real Emacs implementation for Linux. But there's other problems to deal with that. So it might not be perfect depending on how you need to use it. All right, building classes, def class. Parent class for class name is superclass list. Each element of superclass list must be a class, so it can do multiple inheritance. These classes are the parents of the class being created. Every slot that appears in each parent class is replicated in the new class. So, yeah, the next paragraph is also very important. If two parents share the same slot name, the parent which appears in the superclass list first sets the tags for that slot. If the new class has a slot with the same name as a parent, then the new slot overrides the parent slot. So because of the way that CLOS inheritance works, there has to be some heuristic for deciding which slot for a particular name gets used if multiple classes have the same slot name. So that's basically just telling you what the rules are for deciding who gets that slot, which does mean that In a subclass, you can override the definition of a particular slot that comes from a parent, which gives you another way to potentially have custom behavior for a subclass. So like the default value can be different, or certain other aspects of the metadata for that slot could be different, which is kind of interesting. When overriding a slot, some slot attributes cannot be overridden because they break basic OO rules. You cannot override type or protection. So the type like string or protection, which probably means public or private. That's good. That makes sense. And whenever def class is used, excuse me, used to create a new class, a predicate is created for it named class name P. There should be a person -p function. Okay, yeah. And there's also a person list P to see if it's a list of objects. Obsolete. CL type P. Okay, cool. Which are a child of type person. So you can do some type checking of your own if necessary. And then there's this CL type P function, which apparently is what you should be using instead. And you can give it a specifier to use for type checking for a given list. Okay. How to specify parent classes. Well, we saw that already. I don't think there's anything new to see here. Multiple inheritance. Okay. Inheritance in EIEIO is more than just combining different slots. It's also important to method invocation, which we did see before. If a method is called on an instance of my subclass and that method only has an implementation on base class or perhaps my interface, then the implementation for the base class is called. So that's another way that polymorphism sort of comes into play here, because you can call a method that's only defined for the base class. You can have any number of subclasses of that class, and same function can be called for those, unless there's a method that specializes to a particular subclass. Then that one will be called instead. And there's another aspect here too. If there's a method implementation for my subclass, which, okay, it's in the inheritance doc, so it makes sense. There's a method for my subclass and another in my base class. The implementation for my subclass can call up to the superclass as well. So if you've done any object-oriented programming, you know about this concept of calling the superclass method, because sometimes you have shared behavior that needs to be invoked. So that is possible in EIEIO and also in CLOS, as far as I know. All right, so let's go back to building classes and slot options. We probably don't need to go through this very in depth, but slot options might be useful at least. So the init arg, a symbol that can be used in the argument list of the constructor to specify a value for the slot of the new instance being created. So I wonder if it does it by default. Maybe it doesn't do it by default because maybe some of the instance variables you don't want to be settable. So let's see. What if I were to go and, well, all right, def class person. Let's go back to the original def class. All right, so what if I don't want phone to be set when I create an instance of person? I could do that. So I will go, whoa. I need to run this. No, come on. Okay. So now I've created a person where the phone does not have an init arg. So if I were to try to create an instance of person again, let's see if I can find it. Okay, so this one should create a person with a phone number, but it tells me, whoa, Lisp nesting exceeds max Lisp depth. Why though? That can't be a valid error in this case. Okay, that's a bad error, but it basically is telling me that I can't set phone, but should have a better error than that. Fade says, I wholeheartedly recommend The Art of the Meta Object Protocol, which is one of the best comp sci books I've ever read. Yeah, I put a link to that earlier in the show notes. All right. So it is possible to say that a particular slot cannot be initialized whenever you create an instance, which is kind of useful in some cases for encapsulation. You don't want that to happen. So you have to be explicit with init arg, apparently. Init form is the default value. If it's left out, that slot defaults to being unbound, which is interesting. So let's see. Let's try this out. We'll go back to the definition. I will put in init arg phone again, but I will leave out, man, I did it again. I'll leave out the init form, so there's no default value. So init arg is phone. All right, so now if I go to this test person, and I don't put phone, and I create an instance, then there is no slot initialized for test person. How do I access the slot? Is there an accessor function? Person phone? No. Accessing slots. Well, let's go to that. Slot value object slot. So if I were to use the slot value function, give it test person, and ask for phone. Oops, phone. Lisp nesting exceeds max Lisp eval depth. That's great. If I give it name, it will give me back the value of David. Okay. Thanks, Jeff. So, that's interesting. You would have to check to make sure that the slot was bound before you try to access it. So it's probably better to just always have a default value. I mean, it could just be nil if necessary. I see. So also init form apparently automatically quotes whatever you put as the default value. So you cannot invoke a function there, it seems. Because it's something you can do with CLOS. With init form, it's actually a code that you can run. You can put any form there and calculate a value or whatever. Yeah, I don't like that they did that by default. They should have, well, yeah, I can see why they would do it that way, but it's still a little bit weird. Fade says CLOS has definition syntax that will automatically generate slot accessor functions. That's what I read about CLOS, and that's what I assumed that I would see, but that's not the case here. Okay, so type, an unquoted type specifier used to validate data set into the slot. Here are some examples: symbol, number, my class name, or null symbol. So basically, you can have a more complex type predicate here, so where you say that it's either null or a symbol in this field. Now let's take a look at this type predicates really quickly, because I think this is important. CL type P is a function for type checking, which we did see before. Check if object is of type, where type is a quoted type name of the sort used by Common Lisp. For example, CL type P foo integer is equivalent to integer P foo. So I would guess that this integer P foo is effectively a wrapper of calling into CL type P. If the type name is a symbol, Emacs appends -p to the symbol name, blah, blah, blah. Type symbol T stands for the union of all types, just like any type. Null represents the symbol nil. The type symbol atom represents all objects that are not const cells, so something that's not a pair or a list. Type symbol real is synonym for number. There's character. Type list represents all integers between low and high. So you can actually say like a range for integers, which is interesting. List beginning with and, or, and not form combinations of types. For example, or integer float O represents all objects that are integers or non-negative floats. So you can be pretty specific with this, which is kind of interesting. It means that any value you try to set in a given slot can be checked against a non-trivial type predicate, which is not what you get typically with what you would call typical object-oriented languages. Normally with an object-oriented language, there's no concept of like a union of types, where you could say it could be a number or a string. If you wanted that, you would typically have to give like the object type, which, you know, a number and a string might inherit from. So object-oriented languages that are very sort of like class hierarchy focused, they want you to define things in a hierarchy. And what I've found in my career as a programmer is if you are forced to use type hierarchies as a way to model things, then it gets really, really brittle and you come up with really bad designs because you're trying to like shoehorn things into a type hierarchy whenever really what you want is more composability, which this system seems to provide. By having type predicates, you don't have to have a single type hierarchy. You can have multiple type hierarchies, or you can have different types that are just completely disjoint from each other. So I think it's way more flexible. It's another plus in the column of CLOS or CLOS derived things. I'm guessing CLOS has this too. I didn't look into that, but if Emacs has it, I would imagine CLOS also has it. Ernest says, can we also have things like list of type? I think so, yeah. Just checking the chat real quick. Wind Up Boy says, or Fade says, I agree, but Paul Graham has some unorthodox opinions about CLOS. I also went through the whole, like, getting used to doing object-oriented programming and then finding functional languages and really understanding how to write code functionally, and then thinking, wow, object-oriented programming is not so good. But I see the value of a well-designed type system where you can create new types and you can have flexibility in how you define behavior for those types, especially whenever you have such flexibility that CLOS provides. I think it's kind of silly to rule it out just because it's object oriented. It's not the same object orientation as what you see in Java per se. So to define a full Lisp system based on this idea, I think you would be in a much better place than what you see with something like Scheme, where if you want to have a function for a given type, you typically have to prefix the name of the function with the type name. So you would have like string append. And if you look at like the listing of functions for Scheme, typically you're going to see a lot of long function names because you're usually appending, you have the type name and then whatever the action is, which is fine, but it kind of would be nice if you had a particular method as a concept, like a verb, and not have to pollute it with the noun that it applies to, and then you can just have a generic method that you can add implementations to, and then you just have a function name called call or something like that. Or maybe a little bit more specific, but I don't know. I'm starting to come around to the idea of having something like CLOS be like a core feature of a Lisp language, and see how the design of the core libraries grows from that. I'm really considering that for Mesh, because there's something to it. I think it might be pretty useful and interesting. I know that probably a lot of Common Lisp implementations have this already, where you have core types and other stuff in the language that are built using CLOS, but I am not enough of a Common Lisp expert to really know for sure. Fade says CLOS gives rise to very extensible systems. Yes, exactly. So, following on from the discussion from last week about, how to make a program that's as extensible as Emacs, I kind of feel like if you want to have robust code that's also super extensible, CLOS is a way to do that. So, I've got a lot of thoughts in that area. Gun says, I just ordered AMOP. Yeah, I want to get a hard copy of that book because I think it would be pretty cool to have. Fade says, you don't even need the source code. Yeah, that's right. You don't have to have access to the original source code of the program that you are extending to add new stuff to it, which I think is really nice. Maybe Ruby has some similarities in that case. Like you could add methods to an existing object or type from somewhere else. You can, like what they call monkey patching, but I feel like that is not the same. It's the same in terms of the effect that you have on the programming. You can add new methods and anybody can call them, but the whole generic method concept is kind of interesting because you're creating concepts of actions inside of your program that can be extended to new types at runtime by anyone. So it's kind of interesting. Piotr says, Java and C++ OOP is very limited and justly hated, but CLOS seems to be a very different beast. Yeah, it is different. I'm really interested in experimenting more with it. Fade says, Ruby's starting intention was to be Lisp in M expressions. Yeah, I just learned about M expressions when I was looking up some history on Lisp. Apparently, John McCarthy created S expressions, but they were temporary. What he really wanted to do was do something called M expressions, but it looks more like typical code, but it didn't catch on. Humanly Type says, what's AMOP? I've got it in the show notes. If you look in the description, go to the link to the show notes. I've already got it there. It's a book called The Art of the Meta Object Protocol. you can check that out. It's basically a book on the design pattern behind the Common Lisp Object System. And Fade says, when you get used to CLOS, it's very hard to go back to Python. Yeah, Python has a concept of meta classes, and I actually used that a long time ago, but it's you can do some stuff with it, but I think it ends up just being abused to make like global lists of objects of a given type, stuff like that. But you can modify types when they get created, so it has utility. But you know, Python has a lot of magic programming that you end up seeing for various different libraries, so it could be tricky as well. Gun says, M expressions aren't censored by YouTube. Yes, if you type in SEXP, then I think YouTube thinks you're talking about something illicit. Okay. So, list of the forms satisfies predicate represent all objects for which predicate returns true. So you can just have arbitrary functions as a type predicate, which is kind of nice because you could have a function that could do any kind of checks that you want. But I don't know if that ends up being slow because you're just, you know, running arbitrary code at that point. But maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe it's a good thing. CL coerce, not really useful. Def type. This macro defines a new type called name, similar to def macro in many ways. This must be the core of def class. Okay. Type case macros also use type names. Okay, so there's a lot of methods in the CLlib library that work with types, so that might be useful if you do any work with this stuff. Fade says generic functions end up requiring a lot of support in the runtime to optimize and cache function dispatch. I bet that's true. Equality predicates CL equal P. This function is a more flexible version of equal. In particular, it compares strings case insensitively, compares numbers without regard to type. Does this deal with classes somehow? Maybe this is more similar to equal P. Where am I? I'm in the CL library now. I don't want that. Hold up. Let's go back. Oh, CT. Okay. There we are. Okay, so allocation. So allocation is an interesting one. If you set the allocation field on a slot, whenever you're defining a class, you can say it's either class or instance. So it defaults to instance, which means that this slot value will be set for each individual instance of a class, which is what you would expect, because each instance you would think it's like a unique version of an instance of that class, and it has its own separate life, its own separate values, etc. But if you set the allocation to class for a given slot, then that same slot value will be shared across all instances of a given class, which could be used for things like caching certain things that are related to a particular class type. Like if you wanted to cache all instances of a given class, you could have a field to do that. And if you make it where a person can't set that field, like you make it private, then it's sort of like an internal implementation detail. So you can do some internal bookkeeping for a given type, which can be interesting, but it also can be a little bit tricky if you depend on that internal state like that. Documentation, pretty obvious. Accessor, the name of a generic function, which can be used to fetch the value of the slot. So apparently you can set the accessor name and it will generate a function to pull the slot value. So let's actually try that. That might be a useful thing to take a look at. We'll go back into our definition, and we have an init arg phone. We can go back and add a init form of empty, and then we can say accessor. I'm guessing I can say person phone here. Is that gonna work? All right, so now there must be a function called person phone. Yeah, okay, so, oh, and it puts a set F place as well, which is cool. So person phone, I should be able to say, well, let's just try this. Person phone, test person. This may fail. Yeah, it's nil because it's unbound. So let's go back and create a new instance of person that has a phone number. and then run person phone again. It pulls it out. Also, I believe if I were to do this, setf person dash phone person, I might be getting this wrong, so someone tell me if I do. I guess Emacs will tell me if I do it. 555. Oh, I need to put test person in here. So, all right, so that would allow me to set the phone number of person. Now I should be able to get that back out. Okay. So setf is sort of flexible in that it allows you to set the value of a place. So a place gets defined called person phone, which allows you to set the value. All right. And then there's a writer, which allows you to make a function that will write to this slot. Now, it's interesting they say there's a generic function. I like that. So what it actually did in that case is make it so that if I have an employee, so do I have my employee creator in here somewhere? Let me go back to my show notes. All right, so I'm gonna make a test person. Let's just change this to, what? Wow. I pressed Control C and I killed my ILM session. That's great. Let's change this to test employee, okay? Employee, if I can type correctly, employee, all right. So that we have an instance of that now. Now if I use person phone and I put test employee, it will work. And I believe it's because person phone is now a generic function. Which also means that if for Android, I did the same thing, even though it doesn't derive from person. Let's create Android again, but this time let's add phone. If I can go up here and just grab the same phone declaration and put it in right. Where are we? Come on, go right here. What did I just do wrong? All right, let's put it right there. Boom. Accessor person phone. Okay, so now if I create a test Android, let's delete this part here, this part. Let's make this Android. Make this test Android. Okay. Now, whoop, invalid slot name phone. Why? Did I not just create this correctly? Hold on. Yeah, I think I missed that. It's interesting it didn't give me an error when I did that. What? Hold up, what's going on here? There we are. Now, if I make the test Android and I use person phone on test Android, then it pulls the phone number out. So kind of interesting that the accessor actually becomes a generic method instead of just a regular function, because that means that you could have a common naming scheme for accessors for a given slot and then use those across different types even if they don't have the same inheritance hierarchy. So it seems pretty interesting and pretty useful, I think. Piotr says, class allocated fields, same as singletons, big no-no. They make an unhappy mix of a type and global variable. Yeah, it can be a problem, that's for sure. Okay, custom type specifier when you're editing an object of this type. Yeah, that's for the customization system in Emacs so that it shows up correctly in that case. Label when customizing an object, the value of label we use it instead of the slot name. Okay, that's also for Emacs customization system, so you can have an actual string that describes the field being customized. Group as well is for the customization system, putting a given slot into a group. Printer is a function that can print the value of a slot, I'm guessing, in case you want a different output than what the raw value is. The output format must be something that could in turn be interpreted with the read. So because you typically want to be able to round trip objects, if you've never heard that terminology before, round tripping means if you have a live object in a Lisp system and you print it out into standard output, ideally you should be able to take that printed output and then execute it in the Lisp interpreter and get the same object back. That's a pretty lofty goal, I think, for a lot of object types, because you have to make sure that the printed representation actually has all the information necessary to reify or recreate that object. But if you can do it, it's pretty nice because it means that serialization just means print out the object to a file in text and then read it back in with the read method, read function, and then you can get the whole thing back. But I think it's difficult in practice. Maybe Fade has some experience with that and can speak more to that. Oh, so Fade says read print round tripping is explicitly not enabled for CLOS objects. Yeah, probably because it's not easy to accomplish. Protection. This is an old option that is not supported anymore. This is the public protected private thing. So what do you use instead? It's not enforced by the code anymore, and it's not part of the CLOS spec. Interesting. All right, so that was all about building classes, which took a lot of time, but honestly, it's useful information, I think. Class options. Abstract cannot be instantiated. Okay, let's not go into details on those. Let's go back to the higher level information. Making new objects. Probably not a whole lot surprising here. Whoa, how do we get there? So making new objects. All right, so when you define a class, it creates a function with a class name to instantiate a new copy of the object. You can also call make instance, like we saw before, with the symbol representing the class name, and then the init args for that. So you can see here an example of make instance foo with the different slot initializers. So that's pretty straightforward. Accessing slots. The slot value function, which we saw before, set slot value allows you to set the value, but you can also use the setf form as well with the slot value function. So slot value represents not only an accessor for the value, but it can be used as a place for the setf function. Slot make unbound. If you want to make an object slot disappear, you can use slot make unbound, I believe. I think that's the reason for that. Following accessors following a naming and argument order conventions that are similar to those used for referencing vectors. So there's oref, which I'm guessing is object reference. The object in slot. Maybe you can get the default value if it doesn't exist. I don't know. oset also. Object add to list. An object slot add item to the list of elements. Okay, that's kind of a helper method. Because there's the add to list function in Emacs Lisp that is pretty commonly used to add an object to or add an item to a list. Apparently, there's an object add to list where you can add an item to a list that's stored in a slot. Same thing for remove from list. There's a with slots macro, I'm guessing, which you can use to extract a set of slots to form a let binding, I'm guessing, with slots. Spec list object. So if I were to say name phone and then pass in test Android and then say message the phone for S is S, name phone, symbols value as variable. Oh, do I need to have the actual colon on those? Spec list. Maybe I also need to have it be a flat list and not a nest. Oops. All right, let's try this. We'll figure it out. I'm pretty sure it must be one of these. What if I take the colon is part of the symbol. Oh, does it tell me? Spec list is a form similar to let, for example, var1 slot 1 slot 2 slot n. Yeah. Var is the okay. slot specified without a variable name is given in a variable name of the same name as a slot. Okay, so we have to use the colon. Wow, where did I go? So maybe it's just the colon here. Yes, that worked. Okay, so with slots, you can rebind the name, I believe, by doing a let-like syntax here. So I could say name instead of colon name. And I could go here and just use name instead of colon instead. Yep, okay. So that's pretty useful. If you're having to deal with objects where you're pulling out a lot of slots commonly, then having this with slots is pretty helpful for simplifying the code. All right. Writing methods. Writing methods is similar to writing a function. The differences are that there are some extra options and there can be multiple definitions under the same function symbol, where a method defines an implementation for a particular data type. Generic method accepts any argument but contains no code. So a generic method in this case is effectively just a placeholder that allows other real method implementations with the same name to be gathered. And then when that generic method gets called, it dispatches the correct method implementation based on the type of the first parameter. The generic method has no body, is merely a symbol upon which methods are attached. Yeah. Let's take a look at what the generic docs has. Each EIEIO method has a corresponding generic. Generic provides a function binding and a base documentation for the method symbol. You can create a generic manually if you want using cl-def generic, but it seems that happens by default if you use def method. Or cl-def method, as it were. It says here, you can also create a generic method with cl-def method. When a method is created and there's no generic method in place with that name, then a new generic will be created and the method will use it. Yep. I think there is a similar implementation in CLOS. Fade says there is the method keyword in the def generic macro in CL. Okay. So you can specify, what would that do actually? In CLOS, a generic call can also be used to provide an argument list and dispatch precedence for all the arguments. In EIEIO, dispatching only occurs for the first argument. Okay, fine. Yeah, we saw that already. Basically, that dispatch only works in EIEIO on the first parameter in the call, but in CLOS, it could be any of the parameters. All right, methods. CL-def method. All right, so here's the before, around, after thing, which is pretty interesting for extensibility. So CL-def method we saw before for defining that call person method. You have the argument list, the doc string, and the actual forms for the body. But here you can also say before, around, or after. So before, around, and after specify execution order. If none of these symbols are present, the method is said to be a primary, which means that it is the actual method that gets called for that given signature, I suppose, for whatever the dispatcher figures is the method for a given type, that will be called as the primary function. But does it explain those? Okay, so before methods called in sequence, where, like, tell me what it does. I know what it does, but I want it to be explained clearly. So anyway, my understanding is that before and after, they say around doesn't work, but before and after means that if you define a method as before for a given type, that function will be called before the primary function for that specific signature gets executed, or that dispatch gets executed. So you can add hooks effectively. This is almost like advice in Emacs Lisp, where you can say, I want to call this function before the other function. I wonder if it allows you to affect the parameters to the call, though. Fade's given some interesting information here that we'll get back to in a second. So arg list is a list of arguments of this method, docstring forms, blah, blah, blah. A method with no type specializer is a default method. So you could have a method that doesn't have a type specializer in the beginning, and that one will be called if you're calling it on an parameter that does not have a supported type by any other version of that method. So for instance, if we were to say, let's do this. We're gonna put a method here called call person, but we're not gonna have a type specifier here. We're just gonna say pers. And maybe cap s, I don't know. So we have a default implementation here. So we don't know how to call the parameter to this function, right? Because we don't know what type it is. We don't know what to do with it. So I'm just gonna try to print it out. So if I were to say call person now, in this case, oops, then it tells me can't call oops. So you can have a default implementation that does something, which maybe in some cases you want it to raise a specific error to say, I don't know how to deal with this type. But that is a nice thing you can do with methods. All right, only one method per combination of specializers and qualifiers is kept. If two CLDef methods appear with the same specializers and the same qualifiers, then the second implementation replaces the first. Let's try out one of these methods. So let's try this. I'm kind of curious to see what this will do. So let's say after, and I wonder if I just leave this blank. Or maybe I just have the first thing here. So let's take that out too. I did the call. Okay, so that's an after method. Let's see if it gets called after this call person. No. And I wonder why. I executed that, right? So let's try a specific implementation too. So I'll go to, well, let's try this. First person. Maybe the entire list of parameters needs to be represented for it to work. Let's go up to an actual person to call. Test person. Dialing the phone for David. Okay, so it doesn't seem to be working. Maybe I'm doing something wrong though. Let me see what Fade's saying. Okay, Fade's saying you can specify implementations at the same site as the def generic if you use the colon method, which on small method implementations can make for cleaner code. Yeah, definitely. The big object hierarchy, you end up with an explosion of method defs for each more specialized class. eLisp advice system is a half measure to get partway to CLOS. Yeah. Okay. So, do they have an example of this? Because it's not really seeming to work for me. Around method, the most specific around method is called first. Well, it says it doesn't support it. I don't know why they're saying they support it here. Their docs are really out of sync, I think. May invoke the less specific ones via CL call next method. From most specific to least specific. So this can stack. That's kind of interesting. Primary methods, the most specific method is called, which may invoke the less specific methods. After methods called in sequence from least specific to most specific. Okay, that can be pretty powerful, but it can also be very confusing. Is this printing or is it returning a string? Let me actually check the... okay, so I missed this. IELM is not printing the things out, but the I did the call is actually happening. Let me go back to the show notes. So there are two implementations of I did the call now, I think. And if I run, let me check. Let's do this. Oops. So we can say this. I called a person. And then this one will go back to just being plain old purse. So let's reeval this one and this one. So I think what's happening is both of these are actually getting executed after any person call. And let's split this buffer so that we can get the messages buffer visible and see what's happening. And then go into the ILM buffer and run call person again. All right, so it's dialing the phone for David. I tried to call, I called a person. So what's happening here is that because the specializer for this method got triggered for the person type that I'm passing in, both the most generic version of call person after and then the one that goes for that specific type, both got invoked after that function. So it's pretty powerful as an extensibility point, I think, to make it possible to have before and after functions like that. Fade says, call next method is MOP for controlling the effective method. Yeah, you basically get to control the dispatch order. And then Fade also says the meta object protocol is so alien to anybody who has done OOP in any other language that the AMOP book is basically required reading. Yeah, well, so the reason why this is called the meta object protocol is because, to my understanding, it's not just about being able to define classes and methods. In fact, classes and methods are also defined in terms of the meta object protocol. So they can be extended in the same way. There's a reason why you have this concept of meta classes as well. So to really understand what you can do with the CLOS or potentially, well, they say that there's no support for meta classes in EIEIO, but we've already seen multiple inconsistencies in the manual documentation. So I don't know if that's true, but at least for CLOS, it appears that there's some depth to everything that you really need to understand to make the most of CLOS at least. And the AMOP book is definitely the way to go for learning that. Let's go back to the info docs. So this call next method is a thing that you can use inside of a method implementation to then invoke the next method in the current method list. Hey Ramses. How do you control the order the after methods are called? In CL, operational mappers tend to be implemented in terms of a meta class. So it's a good question. Oh, replacement args. I like that. So you can replace the arguments of the call for the next call that gets invoked. So if you wanted to manipulate the parameters, you could do that. Calls a superclass method from a subclass method. This is the next method specified in the current method list. Yeah, so maybe you can't control specifically the order, but you can manually invoke it instead of it being automatically invoked, and you can replace the arguments to get passed into it. You can check to see if there is a next method, which could be useful, I guess. All right, so that is a good thing to see. Static methods, what does that mean? Do not depend on an object instance, but instead operate on a class. Okay, it's a class level method. You can create a static method by using the subclass specializer with CLDef method. Wow, okay. Interesting. So make instance. You can actually customize how an instance of a particular subclass gets created by using def method. Now, this sounds more like the meta object protocol CLOS style stuff to me, because you can do customization of about how instances are created. And like I was saying before, the actual implementation of classes and methods are built using the same stuff that you use to define your own types. And you can see an example of this here. The make instance function is actually a method that you can specialize if you want to. And then you can also use the call next method to control when the next method gets called. So you can call next method before you actually call you finished your current method execution, which is kind of interesting. Maybe that's how before and after are actually implemented. The argument of a static method will be a class rather than an object. Use the functions oref default or oset_default. Okay, interesting. So now let's go back up to the top. Anything else we want to take a look at here? Okay, method invocation. Let's not get into that. Lists of objects as association lists. customizing objects, introspection, browsing your class lists, signals, naming conventions, CLOS compatibility. All right, let's take a look at, I want to know what this association list is. Then introspection would be useful to see, I think. Go there. There you go. Okay, so Fade is saying standard method combination is usually sufficient. If you don't call a next method from your method implementation, you are expected to implement the main method. Interesting. Okay. Lisp offers the concept of association lists, which or a list, which primitives such as assoc used to assoc. How do you pronounce that? Used to access them. The following functions can be used to manage association lists of EIEIO objects. Object assoc, return an object if key is equal to slot's value of an object in list. I'm sorry, what? You can pull an object out of a list if its key is equal to a value. Sorry, if the, what? I need an example. List is a list of objects whose slots are searched. Okay, that's fine. You have a list of objects. Objects in lists do not need to have slot name slot, nor does slot need to be bound. Fine. If these errors occur, these objects will be ignored. If key is equal to slot's value, so key is what you're searching for, slot is the slot name or symbol that you're searching in, and then the list is a list of objects. Fine. Object assoc list, slot list. Return an association list generated by extracting slot from all objects in list. Okay, interesting. You can basically create an A list using just the slot name. EIEIO build class A list. Returns an A list of all currently defined classes. An A list is suitable for completion. Okay, so it's like a tool. All right, fine. And Fade says this assoc stuff isn't a thing in CLOS. This must be some compatibility layer stuff to deal with Emacs Lisp somehow. All right, the next thing we wanted to see was introspection. Wow. Okay, so you have a function that just returns the class slots for an object. So if I call EIEIO, let's actually do that here. EIEIO class slots. There seems to be some other functions here as well. Class slots for test person. Then it's going to give me, you want the class. Fine. I'll give you person. And then it tells me, it gives me a list of all the slot descriptors. Okay, so those are probably classes that you need to use slot accessor to pull this information out for too. Fine. So that's not very interesting. And CLOS probably has better introspection capabilities. Class values, what is that? Describe function command to retrieve information about a class. Okay. And browsing we saw already. I don't know if there's any extra information in there that we want to see. Yeah, it's the same thing we already saw. Okay, CLOS compatibility. Let's take a look at that real quick. Currently, the following functions should behave almost as expected from CLOS. Def class, all slot keywords are available, but not all work correctly. Slot differences are reader and writer tags. Create methods that signal errors instead of creating an unqualified method. Okay. Accessors should create an unqualified method to access a slot, but instead pre-builds a method that gets the slot's value. I don't know what unqualified method means. Type specifier uses the type P function from the CL package, therefore has the same issues as that package. Extensions include the ability to provide object names. Def class also supports class options, but does not currently use the values of meta class and default init args. Okay. Access most of the expected arguments of CLOS def method to typecast against a class. The class must exist before def method is called. Okay. Eric says, if I remember correctly, eLisp is dynamically typed at least to the user, hence multiple equality functions. Yes, I think so. In EIEIO, tags are in lowercase, not mixed case. Okay, whatever. Okay, that's, I mean, not a whole lot of differences, but we did see some inconsistencies, I guess. Or I guess limitations. Wish list. Things about EIEIO that could be improved. Support and compatibility features that would be good to add are support for meta classes. So apparently it's possible, it just hasn't been done yet. Improve integration with the CL package. Well, I'm guessing they mean CL lib at this point because CL has been deprecated. There are also improvements to be made to allow EIEIO to operate better in Emacs environment, allow subclassing of Emacs built-in types such as faces, markers, and buffers. That would be pretty big, I think, for Emacs Lisp. You know, EIEIO is not really something that I see recommended a lot, but if it became a more core part of the Emacs programming model, which this would be required. You know, you could subclass things like, you know, faces, markers, and buffers, or not even really subclassing, but just adding methods against those. Then it might make things a little bit more interesting. Allow method overloading of method-like functions in Emacs. So something that's not explicitly a method could be overloaded in the same way as a method. That sounds like a recipe for trouble, in my opinion. It needs to be a method to start with, probably. Fade is giving a link to a good introduction to this kind of object system. I'm very surprised that YouTube did not eat that. Okay, so that's pretty much it. That's all I had for today. I think it's pretty interesting. Well, EIEIO seems useful, but CLOS and the Meta Object Protocol as a concept, I think is pretty awesome. And I want to do a little bit more experimentation with that in Common Lisp, obviously. There's also, if you use Scheme, or let's say specifically Guile Scheme, there's something called Goops, which is a great name, in my opinion, which is effectively CLOS for Guile Scheme. So if you want to try this out in a Scheme instead of a Lisp implementation, then there's Goops. Obviously, SBCL will have its own CLOS implementation. Where is it? The GigaMonkeys book is listed here also. That's basically what Faye just said. Anyway, I'm not seeing a way to get to the documentation for that for SBCL, but definitely it's something you can use. I'm guessing a lot of the Common Lisp. Oh, okay. Any CL implementation that says they support ANSI Common Lisp will have CLOS built in. That's cool. That's good to have. I'll put a link to Goops in here as well because it's kind of useful to have if you want to try CLOS in Guile Scheme, try Goops. All right. eLisp is not a Lisp 2. Is it not? I thought it was because you can have a variable and a function with the same name. But anyway, definitely, I think that was pretty interesting. So hopefully you found it interesting too. If you have any thoughts about CLOS or EIEIO, or you know some things about it, and you're watching this as a stream recording after the fact, please feel free to leave a comment and let us know what you think. If you found this stream interesting, sort of diving into a more esoteric part of the Emacs Lisp experience or implementation, let me know because I might do more of this type of thing. Judging from the number of people who are still watching by this point, I think maybe it's not as interesting, but it's interesting to me, so that's probably all that really matters in the end. But yeah, that's gonna be it for this week. Thank you all for being here today. Really appreciate the interaction and the feedback, especially from Fade, who has a lot of knowledge in this area. Fade, I call Wind Up Boy Fade because That's what Fade is called in System Crafters IRC, so that's why I'm referencing him here. But anyway, as always, thanks a lot for being here, and until next time, happy hacking. See ya.